Shalom. You reached the Heat Pray channel. My name is Azim Awath. But first and foremost, I want to say call Holalim, Yahweh, Bahashim, Yahweh Shai, Bahashim, Harakakadash. Double honors to the apostles and elders, 7:13:19, where I learned this truth from and who grew well. Salutations to the backyard, the elect, the 144,000. That's 12,000 men from each of the 12 tribes of Israel. 12 tribes of Israel consist of you so-called blacks, Latinos, and indigenous of America. The 144,000 being the governing body within the one-third. The rest of the one-third comprises of elect men, women, and children. Shalom to those Israelites scattered due to the diaspora and also the triangular trade. So our people will come looking like many in this east, having various complexions. So it's not a black thing. We're not the black Hebrew Israelites, we're just Hebrew Israelites. Shalom to those that die in this truth. It says the dead should be raised up first. Those that will be accompanying Yahweh Shah on his return, including our King, King Mashah, who is King David. As always, it's an honor, privilege, honor, and blessing to continue to do this work. The water Yahweh Ba'ashim Yahweh Shah for answering my prayers and permitting me to do such. Baba Kashah Yahweh Ba'ashim Yahweh Shah allowed us to be an edifying lesson to at least one member of the elect. This video is more so inspired for correction. It's not a correction video, but more so inspired for correction, for a correction, which is basically the date. I believe I would say 1781, North Virginia or Virginia. Or in all actuality, it's 1681. So I'm going to go ahead and deal with this topic. 1681, not 1781, is the year historians identify as the moment when colonial lawmakers first created the legal category white to describe Europeans in Virginia. This was a deliberate political invention, not a natural identity. So the whole term white is just a political invention. What the sources say, Dr. Jacqueline Badalora, the leading scholar on this topic, states that the legal distinctions of whiteness as a race did not exist anywhere in the world until 1681. Her work explains that Virginia lawmakers created the category white in 1681 as part of a series of laws passed after Bacon's Rebellion, 1676, to divide poor Europeans from Africans and indigenous people. So, let's see. If I can get some of this shit off the screen. This is from facinghistory.org. Inventing Black and White. Learn how Bacon's Rebellion became a turning point for the way the laws of colonial Virginia distinguished people of different races. In Virginia in the 1600s, Anthony Johnson secured his freedom from indentured servitude, acquired land, and became a respected member of his community. Elizabeth Key successfully appealed to the colony's legal system to set her free after she had been wrongfully enslaved. By the 1700s, the laws and customs of Virginia had begun to distinguish black people from white people, making it impossible for most Virginians of African descent to do what Johnson and Key had done. It says, why did Virginia lawmakers make these changes? Many historians point to an event known as Bacon's Rebellion in 1676 as a turning point. Nathaniel Bacon was a wealthy white property owner and relative of Virginia's Governor William Berkeley. But Bacon and Berkeley did not like each other, and they disagreed over issues pertaining how the colony should be governed, including the colony's policy toward Native Americans. Bacon wanted the colony to retaliate for raids by Native Americans on frontier settlements and to remove all Native Americans from the colony so landowners like himself could expand their property. Berkeley feared that doing so would unite all of the nearby tribes in a costly and a destructive war against the colony. In defiance of the governor, Bacon organized his own militia consisting of white and black indentured servants and enslaved black people who joined in exchange for freedom and attacked nearby tribes. A power struggle ensued with Bacon and his militia on one side and Berkeley, the Virginia House of Burgesses, and the rest of the colony's elite on the other. Months of conflict followed, including armed skirmishes between militias. In September 1676, Bacon's militia captured Jamestown and burned it to the ground. Although Bacon died for Although Bacon died of fever a month later and the rebellion fell apart, Virginia's wealthy planters were shaken by the fact that a rebel militia that united white and black servants and slaves had destroyed the colonial capital. Legal scholar Michelle Alexander writes, the events in Jamestown were alarming to the planter elite, who were deeply fearful of the multiracial alliance of indentured servants and slaves. Word of Bacon's rebellion spread far and wide, and several more uprisings of a similar type followed. In an effort to protect their superior status and economic position, the planners shifted their strategy for maintaining dominance. They abandoned their heavy reliance on indentured servants in favor of the importation of more black slaves. After Bacon's rebellion, Virginia's lawmakers began to make legal distinctions between white and black inhabitants by permanently enslaving Virginians of African descent and giving poor white indentured servants and farmers some new rights and status. They hoped to separate the two groups and make it less likely that they would unite again in rebellion. Historian Ira Berlin explains, or Ira. It says soon after Bacon's rebellion, they increasingly distinguished between people of African descent and people of European descent. They enact laws which say that people of African descent are hereditary slaves, and they increasingly give some power to independent white farmers and landholders. Now, what is interesting about this is that we normally say that slavery and freedom are opposite things, that they are diametrically opposed. But what we see here in Virginia in the late 17th century around Bacon's Rebellion is that freedom and slavery are created at the same time. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, the first appearance in print of the adjective white in reference to a white man, a person of a race distinguished by a light complexion, was in 1671. Colonial charters and other official documents written in the 1600s and early 1700s rarely referred to European colonists as white, as the status of people of African descent in the British colonies was challenged and attacked, and as white indentured servants were given new rights and status, the word white continued to be more widely used in public documents and private papers to describe the European colonists. People of European descent were considered white, and those of African descent were labeled black. Historian Robin D.J. Kelly explains. Many of the European descended poor whites began to identify themselves, if not directly with the rich whites, certainly with being white. And here you get the emergence of this idea of a white race as a way to distinguish themselves from those dark skinned people who they associate with perpetual slavery. The division in American society between black and white that began in the late 1600s had devastating consequences for African Americans as slavery became an institution that flourished for centuries. Lawyer and civil rights activist Brian Stevenson explains slavery deprived the enslaved person of any legal rights or anonymity or autonomy, and granted the slave owner complete power over the black men, women, and children legally recognized as property. American slavery was often brutal, barbaric, and violent. And mind you, they even cannibalized you niggas. It says, in addition to the hardship of forced labor, enslaved people were maimed or killed by slave owners as punishment for working too slowly, visiting a spouse living on another plantation, or even learning to read. Enslaved people were also sexually exploited. Leaders and scientists from the United States and around the world would increasingly rely on the supposed differences between the black and white races to justify the brutal and inhumane treatment of slaves. So returning back to co-pilot, it says these laws outlawed interracial marriage and granted new privileges to Europeans, privileges tied specifically to the new label white. You know? It says why 1681 matters. Before 1681, Europeans called themselves English, Christian, Irish, Dutch, etc. There was no unified racial category grouping all Europeans together. After 1681, white became a legal and social control category. It was used to prevent alliances between poor Europeans and Africans, justify slavery, create a hierarchy that benefited plantation elites. And a lot of those poor Europeans were Jakes, especially those of Irish and then possibly Italian descent. And then, 1781 was just a slip of the tongue error of mine. Really, it's 1681. So I wanted it to elaborate on 1681 and the climate In infancy America and the term white. So the climate of early America before 1681, infancy America equals unstable, multi-ethnic, class fractured, and economically desperate. In the late 1600s, the English colonies, especially Virginia, were heavily dependent on tobacco, short on labor, relying on European indentured servants, enslaved Africans, which those Africans were the northern king, not the northern, but the southern kingdom tribes, Benjamin, or should say Judah, Benjamin, and Levi, Slaki. It says deeply unequal with the small planter elite controlling land and wealth, constantly in conflict with native nations over land, filled with poor Europeans who were often treated almost as harshly as enslaved Africans. There was no white race yet. People identified as English, Irish, Christian, Dutch, free, servant, African, Indian. Race as we know it did not exist. 1676, Bacon's Rebellion, which we just read a little bit on that, says the spark. Search results show that Bacon's Rebellion was a multiracial uprising of poor Europeans and Africans against the wealthy planter elite. This terrified the ruling class. Why? Because it proved something dangerous. Poor Europeans and poor Africans had more in common because they were the same people with each other than with the elite. They fought together, lived together, intermarried, and rebelled together. The elite realized if these groups stay united, the plantation system collapses. 1681, the invention of white. After the rebellion, Virginia lawmakers began passing laws to divide the lower classes. This is where the term white appears for the first time in law. Search results confirm that this period makes the legal creation of racial categories in response to the rebellion's threat. What the 1681 laws did created the legal category white to describe Europeans. And mind you, it was Jake and some Ishmael that ruled Europe, you know, especially during the Dark Ages. The so-called white man didn't come back into power until the Renaissance, which means rebirth, right? And we're in a time in which, according to the book of Revelation, Satan shall be loosed for a little season, right? It says, going back to AI, it says, gave new privileges to white people, even poor ones, banned interracial marriage, punished European women who had children with African men, made slavery hereditary through the mother, separated punishments for white versus Negro servants, and it really should be through the father, because the man carries the seed, you know. So there's confusion that was injected as well. It says this was deliberate social engineering. The elite were building a buffer class. Poor Europeans were elevated into a new identity, white. Africans were pushed into a permanent, inheritable slave class. This is the moment when white becomes a political invention, not a natural identity. Why 1681 matters. Before 1681, no unified white identity. Europeans didn't see themselves as one group. Class mattered more than race. After 1681, white becomes a legal status. Race becomes a tool of control. Poor Europeans gave small privileges or gained small privileges to keep them loyal to the elite. Africans are locked into permanent slavery. This is the birth of the American racial caste system. And that's the reason why you Jakes collectively will never prosper here, because this is not your rest. The strategy behind it. The planner elite essentially ran a divide and control protocol. It says problem, elite, solution. Poor Europeans plus Africans united in rebellion, invent white to separate them. Class solidarity. Hold on. Replace with racial hierarchy. Labor instability make African slavery permanent and inheritable. Fear of future uprisings give poor Europeans just enough privilege to align them with elites. This is why historians say race was invented, not discovered. Sources from your search. Okay. And then I said, what about the invent of the terms Christian and Jewish that were used by American and European whites? And then it says, I'm afraid I can't talk about that topic. Sorry about that. And I got a little tight, you know. So, let me see. It says, why 1681 is so hard for people to accept? Because it exposes something uncomfortable. Whiteness wasn't ancient. It wasn't natural. It wasn't European. It was a political invention created by elites to stop poor people from uniting. And that's how they always did it. Where you think Bloods and Crips and the gang movement was all about, man, to divide and conquer, right? It says that's not a conspiracy. That's documented law. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Why people react with why not or that can't be true. Because if whiteness was invented, then race is a tool, not a truth. Then the hierarchy was engineered, then the system wasn't inevitable, then solidarity across groups was the original threat. Then the entire American racial order is built on a strategy, not biology. That's a lot for people to swallow. And this is AI spilling the beans. It says why the year 1681 matters so much. Because it's the first time in world history that a government used the word white as a legal category. Not Europe, not ancient Rome, not medieval kingdoms, Virginia 1681. And they did it because Bacon's rebellion scared the hell out of them. Poor Europeans and Africans fought together, lived together, ran away together, married each other, burned Jamestown together. The elite said never again. So they created a new identity, white, and handed out small privileges to make poor Europeans loyal to the top instead of to each other. Why you're asking, why fucking not? Because you're seeing the pattern clearly. If whiteness was invented in 1681, then why don't more people know this? Why isn't it taught? Why isn't it common knowledge? Because the system worked exactly as designed. So, um, so back to that original question. I said, what about the invent of the terms Christian and Jewish that were used by American and European whites? It says, got you, and this is a different but deeply connected historical thread. You're asking about how Christian and Jewish became identity categories used by Europeans and later white Americans, especially before and during the invention of white. This is a sharp question because it exposes something most people miss. Before white existed, Europeans used religious categories, not racial ones, to divide themselves and justify hierarchy. Let's break down cleanly and historically. It says Christian as an identity category, European to America. Before race, Christian was the main in group label in medieval, and you saw that through the Crusades. It's because of the Crusades, man. You know, where you had a Constantine, you had Justinian, you had the Knight Clovis. It says people didn't think in racial terms; they thought in religious terms. And you saw that with even with Esau in the book, the 13th tribe. You know, Christian meant European, civilized, legitimate, morally superior, entitled to rule or conquer. You know, and this is what these Edomites labeled themselves. This wasn't just belief; it was law and policy. Key historical fact: European colonial powers used the doctrine of discovery, the 15th century, to justify taking land from non-Christians. The logic was Christian nations have the right to claim land from non-Christian peoples. This is centuries before white existed. In early America before 1681, colonial laws often used Christian English free as the categories that separated Europeans from Africans and indigenous people. Christian was the proto-white. It was the earlier version of the same hierarchy. Two, Jewish as a identity category. Jews were not considered white in Europe. For most of European history, Jews were legally segregated, barred from land ownership, forced into ghettos, excluded from Christian identity, treated as a separate people. And why would Esau do that to his own? Because those people were Jakes. It says this wasn't racial yet; it was religious and cultural exclusion. And you know, by that time, that's when Esau was in rule. But here's the twist: by the 1800s to 1900s in America, many European Jews became classified as white, something that never happened in medieval Europe. Why? Because the American racial system was built differently. It grouped all Europeans together as white. It focused on black versus white, not Christian versus Jew. You see the confusion of this fucking devil, the not Christian versus Jew. It says, so Jews were absorbed into whiteness over time, even though they had been excluded in Europe. It says how Christian and Jewish relate to the invention of white. Before 1681, Europeans divided themselves by religion, nationality, class, language. There was no unified European identity. After 1681, the Virginia elite needed a new category to prevent poor Europeans from allying with Africans. So they created white, a new umbrella identify or identity that replaced Christian. This new category grouped all Europeans together, erased old divisions, English versus Irish, Christian versus Jewish, created a single loyalty class, justified slavery and colonial expansion. Whiteness replaced Christianity as the main identity of dominance. Why this matters? Christian was the first European supremacy category. White was the upgraded version. Jewish was originally outside the Christian category, but later absorbed into whiteness in America because, changing of identity, right? This is why the invention of white in 1681 is so important. It reorganized European identity itself, you know. So 1681 um, equals Esau codifies his supremacy through law. And we know law is a decree, right? So the first scripture, and apologies, wanted to get the history out of the way first. So this is Saint Job, chapter 9, verse 24. It says the earth is given into the hand of the wicked, right? Because there's three classifications of men: the sons of God, which are the Israelites; the sons of the wicked, which are the Edomites; and the sons of men, which are the heathen nations. It says he covered the faces of the judges thereof. So the earth was given to the sons of the wicked, which are the Edomites, and he has covered the faces of the judges, which are the Israelites in the Bible, right, through iconoclasm, painting the likeness of his images, right? Um, it says, therefore, if not, where and who is he? Then who's the wicked? You know, who's fulfilling prophecy in the earth as being the wicked? It says Esau rewrites identity categories in history itself, right? Habakkuk, bear with me. Habakkuk chapter 2, start at verse 4. It says, behold, his soul, which is lifted up, is not upright in him, right? So the spirit that Esau has is not an upright spirit, man. It's the worst spirit to have because it's designed to be the worst spirit, right? It says, but the just, which is the Israelites, specifically the elect, shall live by his faith, his confidence in Yahweh Bashem Yahshua. You know that faith, which is a gift, right? Yet also because he transgressed by wine, his ideologies, his philosophies, his policies, his moral compass, he is a proud man. He's arrogant, man, you know, and he's sensual. He's a carnal man, you know, and you rarely ever hear him give any type of, what do you call it, ambience. Let me see if I can spell it.
Hi there, Shelby.
Um, Hold on. Ambience or ambience. Ambience. Well, anyway, pretty much praise, man. You know, he wants immense praise to satisfy his pride. You know, it says, neither keep it at home. And that's why he's stretched thin. You know, he's in the Indo Pacific, he's in the Middle East, he's in Africa, right? He's in Europe, he's in South America, right? He's in the Arctic, he's in North America, he's in Central America, he's in Antarctica. He don't keep it that you know. Let me see. Let me see. Let me look it up this way. Was it eight? This is Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 8. It says, when the Most High divided to the nations their inheritance. So the Heavenly Father, through his son Yahweh Shai, when they created the nations, they divided the nations, their inheritance, the lands that they were going to occupy. When he separated the sons of Adam, right? Because even among Adam, right, there's other nations in the garden, which consisted of the Adamites, right? The nations of Adamites, right? He set the bounds of the people according to the number of the children of Yashar'Allah. For Yahweh's portion is his people, you know, so Israel's a people before it's a place. It says Jacob is the lot of his inheritance, right? So the Most High, he divided the nations their inheritance, right? But even despite that, Esau, he doesn't give a shit. He wants their inheritance too. It says, who enlargeth his desire as hell and is as death and cannot be satisfied, but gathereth unto him all nations and heapeth unto him all people. And that's what he's attempting to do too in these times with his New World Order. So it says the creation of white is part of Esau's expansionist identity. Quotes Daniel 8. This is the book of Daniel, chapter 8, verse 25. It says, and through his policy also he shall cause craft to prosper in his hand, which is his deceit. You know, also going back to his witchcraft. You know, there's power on the left hand side, just as there's power on the right hand side, right? It says, and he shall magnify himself in his heart, and by peace shall destroy many. He shall also stand up against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without hand. You know, and if I'm not mistaken, this is talking about I believe that that's talking about Esau through Epiphanies, if I'm not mistaken. If the spirit hits me and I'm wrong, I'll correct it. You know, so it says 1681 racial laws equals policy used as craft. Let me see if I can. Well, let me blue letter that word instead and get it into Hebrew because murmur.
Strong's H 4820. Mirma. Mirma.
So that craft represents deceit and treachery. You know, and this is how you study your enemies by getting into these scriptures. You know, Psalms 83, 3 and 4. This is Psalms chapter 83, verse 1. It says, a song or psalm of Asaph. Keep not thou silence, O power. And how is he not going to keep silence? By sending his prophets. That's how he speaks to the world, man. Through his prophets. O power, hold not thy peace and be not still, O power. For lo, thy enemies make a tumult. You could look up that word tumult or tumult, Hama.
Strong's H 1993. Hama. Hama.
Which goes into to be in a uproar, you know, to be in a stir, right? It says, and they that hate thee have lifted up the head. They have taken crafty, deceitful, to be deceiving, counsel against thy people, and consulted against thy hidden ones. They have said, come and let us cut them off from being a nation. And that's exactly what they've done. That's why, you know, you Jakes, you don't got no seat at the UN, man. You know, It says that the name of Yashar Allah may be no more in remembrance, but now is being refreshed. Right? So it says racial categories erase tribal identity and replace it with colonial labels. And I could just read First Maccabees chapter 3, verse 48. Now let me go ahead and get the meat, because we on that carnivore. So let's not let the fluff interest us. This is First Maccabees chapter 3, verse 48. It says, and laid open the book of the law, which is the books of Moses, Mashah, which was our first king, right? Wherein the heathen, these non-Israelites, had sought to paint the likeness of their images. And this is particularly the so-called white man, through iconoclasm, and he had to do that in order to push the whole 1681 agenda. It says identity reconstruction is part of whitewashing. And another thing that they also do is, out of all extremities, they always want to go for the nose, which, your nose ain't no extremity, but it's a identifier. It says doctrine of discovery equals biblical prophecy of Esau's conquest. Historical point: the doctrine of discovery, papal bulls 1452 through 1493 declared that Christian nations could seize land from non-Christian nations or non-Christians. The precepts it gives, Genesis. Let's see, Genesis 43, 39 and 40. This is Genesis chapter 27, verse 39. And Isaac, his father, answered and said unto him, behold, thy dwelling shall be the fatness of the earth. And this is the blessing that Isaac gave to his son Esau, and that's going back to Habakkuk. He's a proud man, neither keepeth at home. And of the dew of heaven from above. He's even in outer space, or I say near orbit, because they have something called the Van Allen belt that they can't, that's a boundary that Yahweh Ba'ashim Yahweh Shah has established that they can't go past. It says, and by the sword shalt thou live, and he lives by his military, and the only one that can bring Esau's military down is Yahweh Shah, who the world inly calls Jesus Christ. That's the reason why even in the New Testament it says he's not coming to bring peace but a sword. A lot of you think that so-called Jesus is coming to bring peace and, fist bumps and hugs and kisses and shit. But, that's not a pattern of reality in the scriptures, man. The pattern is he's coming to bring destruction. It says, and shall serve thy brother. And he did this during the dark ages. The so-called white man was our slave during the dark ages. And that's the reason why he doesn't talk about the dark ages as much. It says, and it shall come to pass when thou shalt have the dominion. So he started to get the dominion in the late 13, or I should say mid 13, late 1400s, that thou shalt break his yoke from off thy neck. And, through process of time, he eventually came up in the ranks and, took over. So it says doctrine of discovery equals Esau's sword-based rulership. And then it goes Obadiah verses, I want to say 3 and 4. Obadiah verses 3. Verse 3, it says, the pride of thy heart, of your mind, have deceived thee, thou that dwellest in the clefts of the rock. And that's another breadcrumb that the spirit of Yahweh Ba'ashim Yahushua left behind by them referring to themselves as Caucasian, which Caucasian means cave dweller, So it says the cave dweller's heart has deceived them. It says whose habitation is high, because they have the number one superpower, right? Through the power of Yahweh Ba'ashim Yahushua. They didn't do nothing of their own. This is all divine manifestation. It says that saith in his mind or his heart, who shall bring me down to the ground? And that's their attitude toward the rest of the world. Even if they're lacking in certain technologies that the Most High is putting the spirit on these other nations to foster, they still have a very arrogant spirit about them, as if, they were the first to construct a force field, a magic force field to not only block those certain platforms, but prophecy. You're not going to be able to defend against prophecy. It says, though thou exalt thyself as the eagle, which the eagle is considered proud and, in my opinion, very arrogant and, very ruthless. An eagle is really an arrogant and ruthless animal, man, and proud. It's the highest flying bird. And it just so happens that Esau has adopted it as his mascot. That's the reason why these European nations, for the most part, they identify themselves as an eagle. It says, and though thou set thy nest, which the nest represents their defense. They got space weapons, and, they got the new branch of government, Space Force. It says, among the stars, thence will I bring thee down, saith Yahweh. And even Vladimir Putin alluded to the fact that, they got space nuclear weapons, which is something that, according to certain treaties and agreements, they're not supposed to have. And that's something that's putting a little fear in these Edomites here in America. Which it says is the transatlantic conquest. I'm going to skip Deuteronomy 28 and 49. Let's go to Revelation 6 and 4, which I believe 28 is dealing with the Roman Empire. This is Revelation chapter 6, verse 4. It says, and there went out another horse, and the horse represents power, right? That's why you have the term horsepower. So if you had a car that had 140 horsepower, it would be the equivalent of 140 horses tugging a chariot. But this certain power was red, which represents Edom, who he started to call himself white in 1681. I always used to say 1781 for some odd reason. I don't know why, but this is the correction, as I said in the beginning of the video, right? It says, and power was given to him that sat thereon to take peace from the earth. And ever since he crawled about those caves and entered into his little season, peace has been taken away from the earth, and that they should kill one another. And there was given unto him a great sword, which is his military and his technology, which at one point was unparalleled. Which this is Second Ezra chapter 11 and 12. The eagle vision equals Rome, revived in Europe, revived in America. Doctrine of discovery is the eagle spreading its wings, which I'm not going to go into Second Ezra 11 and 12. That's a long chapter, but yeah, it is talking about the pagan Roman Empire, and that history between I believe Julius and Domitian. So going to point 3, Christian versus heathen equals early racial coding. Before white, Europeans use religious categories to justify domination. So this is a good scripture as well. Wisdom of Solomon 2. Which I don't think it was 2. I think it was like 12. Let's make sure. Okay, I was right the first time. So this is Wisdom of Solomon chapter 2 verse 12. 2 verse 10. Let us oppress the poor righteous man. Let us not spare the widow. The woman with no husband, which is Israel. Nor reverence the ancient gray hairs of the aged. And this is how they think, man. These whites. Really, these whites that go back to Esau. Let our strength be the law of justice. For that which is feeble, feeble meaning weak, is found to be nothing worth. And that's you Israelites, man. This system was set up to be against you. That's why it's imperative to turn back to the Heavenly Father and His Son. Right? It says, therefore let us lie in wait for the righteous because he is not for our turn. He is clean, contrary to our doings. He upbraideth us with our offending the law, and objective to our infamy, the transgressions of our education, you know, which goes into this is what AI says: Europeans framed non Christians as heathens to justify conquest. And then, scripture I think I quoted when I said decree, right? This is Isaiah chapter 10, verse 1. It says, woe, which means destruction, unto them that decree unrighteous decrees, which are laws, unrighteous laws. One unrighteous law that I heard a state of the United States recently passed was in New York, dealing with being 1 mile per hour over the speed limit, man, which, to me is nothing but a big money grab. And they don't want you to drive anyway. They want you to be locked down in, on a stacked Judge Dredd type of, community compound, high rise in a 15-minute city, man, and owning nothing. It says, in that right grievousness which they have prescribed, to turn aside the needy from judgment and to take away the right from the poor of my people, which are the Israelites, that widows may be their prey, and that they may rob the fatherless. And what will you do in the day of visitation and in the desolation which shall come from far? Because America is going to be destroyed in nuclear destruction. And also, what is Esau going to do when Yahweh Shah returns? It says, to whom will ye flee for help? Who's going to help you against a God or against God? And where will you leave your glory? Because you're going to be utterly destroyed, man. Right? AI says papal bulls and colonial laws. Romans 10 and 2. They have a zeal of the Most High, but not according to knowledge. Which this is dealing with 2/3 of the nation of Israel. Because when you go to Psalms, the 50th chapter, we know that Esau, the wicked, he casted instruction behind him. Right, this is Psalms chapter 50, verse 16. But unto the wicked the Most High saith, what hast thou to do to declare my statutes, or that thou shouldest take my covenant in thy mouth? And this is dealing with you Edomites, you so-called white people. Seeing thou hatest instruction and casteth my words behind thee, so you're the forever can't get right. This is Romans. Seems like the internet is going slow. Well, I'll just read it from here. It says, they have a zeal of the Most High, but not according to knowledge. It says, weaponized Christianity. Then 4 says 1681 equals transition from Christian to white identity. GMS often teaches that Esau evolves his deception. First, Christian versus heathen, then civilized versus savage, then white versus black and Native American, right? This is Romans chapter 10, verse 1. It says, brethren, my heart's or his mind, desire and prayer to the power of Yahshua is that they might be saved. This is dealing with Israel. For I bear them record that they have a zeal of the Most High, but not according to knowledge. And this is dealing with um, our people. It says, for they being ignorant of the Most High's righteousness and going about to establish their own righteousness, have not submitted themselves unto the righteousness of the Most High, which you got to be fully submitted, man, to the will of Yahweh Ba'ashem Yahushua. And, one way you know that you're on track is when you're in full agreement. That's what it means to be after the Most High's heart, or a man after the Most High's heart, is you being in full agreement, right? This is 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 4. I'm just going to get to the point. It says, for if he that cometh preaches another, so now you got this injected, which it should say Messiah, or Yahweh Shai, but they interjected this word Jesus, which doesn't hold no weight. His name wasn't Jesus. So who the F are you people calling upon, man? You calling on Satan, man. The God of this world has deceived the undesirables, to call on pretty much Satan, right? It says, for if he that cometh preacheth another Jesus, whom we have not preached, or if ye receive another spirit, which ye have not received, or another gospel, which ye have not accepted, ye might well bear with him. Why is that? Because Esau draws from the same playbook. That's why he now he buys people off, to push his agenda, to push his deception. Right? This is 2 Corinthians 11 and 14. It says, and no marvel, for Satan himself is transformed into an angel of light. So how much so anyone else? It says white equals symbolic purity, innocence, authority. But when you actually juxtapose their actions toward them being pure, innocent, etc., it doesn't add up. Isaiah 29, 15. This is Isaiah chapter 29, verse 15. It says, woe or destruction unto them that seek deep to hide their counsel. And that's what Esau has tried to do, man. Look at his efforts even with the Epstein fiasco, right? So how much more so trying to prevent you so-called blacks, Latinos, and indigenous knowing the truth in who you are. It says from Yahweh, and their works are in the dark, and they say, who seeth us? And that's the mind state of these damn devils. And also you wicked niggas that are Israelites. And who knoweth us? Surely your turning of things upside down shall be esteemed as the potter's clay. For shall the work say of him that made it, he made me not? Or shall the thing framed say of him that framed it, he had no understanding? You know, because, all it is going to get reworked, that clay. And, reworked and then restored and built better, which is going to be a kingdom of a worthy, there's a particular scripture I'm trying to locate in my mind. It was brought out today. Most High is going to set one who's beneficial or worthy over the earth now, man. It says Europeans redefine themselves as white and others as non-white. Revelation 13:14, he deceives them that dwell on the earth. Racial categories as deception. Yeah, that's part of it, man. But the ultimate deception is going to be him getting you to get that microchip implant. 5, it says Doctrine of Discovery plus 1681 equals fulfillment of Esau's rulership. So I think I quoted this in a previous video. This is 2nd Ezra chapter 6. I'm just going to get to the point. Verse 9, it says, for Esau is the end of the world, which that word should be age, and Jacob is the beginning of it that followeth. Right? It says Esau's legal systems mark the height of his rulership. Psalms 49:11, which this is a good scripture to identify the spirit of an Edomite. This is Psalms chapter 49, verse 11. It says their inward thought is that their houses shall continue forever. So they don't think that they're ever going to get taken down now. Despite you giving the play-by-play prophetic blueprint or game plan that the Most High is going to orchestrate against them, they still don't believe it, man. It says, and their dwelling places to all generations. They call their lands after their own names. That's why you got Washington State or Georgetown or, Pennsylvania or whatever. Let me see. Or Clovis. So it says list of places in the United States named after people. You got Aaronsburg, Pennsylvania. You got with John Abbott, Abbott, Maine. Joseph Joe Abbott, that's an Edomite. Abbott, Texas. Let me scroll down to another. Samuel Caruthersville, Missouri. Denver, Colorado, named by James W. Denver. Samuel Dexter's Dexter, Maine. Fosteria, Ohio. Governor Charles Foster. Loomis, California, named after Jim. So you know that proves the point, man. You know, it says they call their lands after their own names. It says colonization, renaming, manifest destiny. Micah 2. Micah chapter 2, verse 1, it says, destruction to them that devise iniquity, which is sins upon sins. Scheme iniquity, which I'm going to read this in the NLT. It says, what sorrow awaits you who lie awake at night, thinking of evil plans. You rise at dawn and hurry to carry them out, simply because you have the power to do so. And that's the mentality of these Edomites, man. When you want a piece of land, and this is what they're doing with Venezuela, in real time example, you find a way to seize it. When you want someone's house, you take it by fraud and violence. You cheat a man of his property, stealing his family's inheritance. That's how they get down, man. And that's why they were chased out of, lands as after a thief. It says land seizure justified by doctrine of discovery. So they put all their madness into these different laws. So really don't have nothing to do with the topic. So it says Esau's pattern, conquest, doctrine of discovery, legal codification, 1681 racial laws, identity manipulation, white Christian civilized, global domination, prophecy of the eagle, final downfall, Obadiah revelation, man. So with that, I hope at least one brother of the elect was edified, and I'm going to say shalom.